I lost everything. I was overwhelmed with paranoia. I was slipping in and out of consciousness. The most hurtful loss was my family. After the divorce, the kids never looked at me the same. That's the one that stings the most. I can't be the only person that's gone through this. I can't be.
Bob Schwartz is a solid, driven, hard-working guy. He gets up early each morning to sell appliances at a home improvement retailer in the Atlanta area. 16 years ago, he was a proud family man and a top executive at one of the fastest-growing telecom companies in the world, with good health and a promising career in front of him. But life threw him an unfortunate curveball in the form of a simple prescription medication.
My dad grew up an only child, Jewish, converted to Catholicism to marry my mom, which is a great, unbelievable story. And at the wedding reception, he stood up in front of the reception crowd and said, thanks for coming today. Me and Peg are going to start a family right away, and we plan on having 10 kids. Well, brought laughter to the reception hall, but 11 kids later, my dad was true and accurate. I go by Bob. Was born in Hackensack Hospital in April of 1963. I like to call it one of the greatest families ever. I was the 10th of 11 brothers and sisters. We took pride in saying that the order was Jeannie, Mary, Margie, Randy, Johnny, Jimmy, Annie, Joey, Tommy, Bobby, and Paul. I catch a lot of grief saying, you took that from Good Will Hunting. And I said, no, Matt Damon took that from me. Mom cracked 24 eggs for breakfast every single morning. It was off to school. When we got back from school, we did chores. The ball fields would come alive, the basketball court during the proper seasons, fun and joy, always with a great religious theme that our family operated by. My dad passed away when I was 11 years old, which was about the first curveball. I call it my mom's double down on God moment in life. I learned a lot of lessons from my mom in those moments. To be left with a family of 11 at 52 would be hard on any woman. She did it with such dignity and grace. I moved down to Greensboro, North Carolina. I was part of a great state championship football team there, where I learned a lot of great lessons from that team, anticipating where plays were going to be going to knock the snot out of a running back or a wide receiver.
Bob Schwartz led a Pirate charge to recover it for the touchdown, and Page took the lead 14-7.
We were hanging out in college, and I needed something, and he popped right over and bring it right away. He'd give you the shirt off his back. Me and my friends and Bob were standing right at the 50-yard line, front row seats. Everybody's thinking about jumping over. We're like, should we go, should we go? Bob goes first. Down-to-earth guy, salt of the earth Bob is.
Moved down to Atlanta, summer of 1987. Started with a telecom job. It was a great period in my life. I was young, single, worked hard, played hard. 4 years later, I met my wife, Lisa. One date led to another. She liked to play chess. It was a great strategic mind game. She was very competitive like me. She loved to play golf. We had great banter together. Felt a lot of fun spirit in the relationship. Got married in 1993. Started a family 18 months later with our first daughter, Brooke McCabe Schwartz. My dad used to always try to balance a child in his hand. I always try to balance my daughter in that hand. She has the most beautiful copper top red hair. People would stop everywhere and just say, oh my gosh, what gorgeous red hair. From your mom's side of the family, you get that from your dad's side of the family, and without a beat. She said, I got that from God. She nailed that one.
That's right.
3 years later, we were blessed with a son, Jack Anthony. 2 beautiful kids, brought great joy I felt so good about going into work and coming home and starting the second half of my day. From the minute I walked in that door, be doing tumbling exercises, wrestling on the floor, great infectious laughs. The laughter you could hear throughout the whole house. You know, at that age, I'm their hero. I met Kevin Kiernan in 1996, and it seems like if things could accelerate from there, they did. We started winning numerous large accounts.
When Bob would interact with customers, you could tell it was just very sincere, right? He's very genuine, very easily attached to their challenges, put himself in their shoes, so to speak. That made him very successful, and I was always excited to be involved in his opportunities because I knew things were going to go as smoothly as they possibly could.
Kevin, pure motivational, a leader, mentor, coach. Using the football analogies, I almost felt like an Eli Manning, Tom Brady, or Drew Brees. And Kevin gave me full reign to call the right plays. We won a lot of Super Bowls together. God meant for me to be a we guy and not a me guy.
WorldCom, a telecom giant destroyed by a massive accounting fraud.
WorldCom had a lot of success. There was a lot of real revenue, a lot of real customers, real successful employees, and a very good growth trajectory. The problem they had was they overstepped their bounds in trying to meet Wall Street expectations, and that simply blew up in their face.
Everything started changing. After 9/11, a lot of organizations start missing numbers. You know the old phrase of having the rug pulled out from underneath your feet? For me, it became reality. In the late part of 2001, there was a number of executives that were being investigated by the FBI for sales fraud. Being within the top 10 of the organization, your first thought is, Bob Schwartz is definitely behind this kind of fraud. And they audited my accounts 4 times. 4 times. The amount of stress was excruciating. I knew I'd done nothing wrong.
The WorldCom situation was extremely unfortunate. A lot of good people got hurt financially from that.
Basically, that fall after 9/11 is when I first started experiencing a little bit of back pain. March of 2004, went in to see my doctor. I thought he had the same values that I had. We had talked about some focus issues that I was having at work. He said, you know, that could be ADHD. And that's when he gave me a free sample of a drug called Concerta. And I remember him specifically asking me, how much do you weigh? And I gave him my weight, and he started me at 54 milligrams. Obviously, whenever I took a drug, I always asked, okay, tell me what side effects I'm going to feel. The only thing he told me, said, this has an appetite suppressant in it, so you might not be feeling all that hungry. That was the only warning I ever got on these drugs. Didn't realize it at the time, but it was going to alter my life.
Bob's diagnosis of ADHD was not arrived at in a professional manner because no psychological testing was done to rule in, rule out the presence of the disorder. He was not seen by a psychiatrist to be able to treat it appropriately in a medical fashion.
A diagnosis of ADHD does not involve a blood test. It does not involve, kind of an objective infection or anything like that. And, it sort of has some symptoms associated with it, but it does not get easily diagnosed simply by talking with a person.
If I suspected a patient of having ADHD, then I would put them through a series of tests, very specific tests, to diagnose and rule in and rule out the presence of the disorder and its symptoms. I would do some very detailed history and family background. And then at that point, if I felt that there was a good evidence that there was ADHD present, I'd refer them to a physician to start a trial. And the normal starting dose, for example, for a medication like Concerta would be 18 milligrams. Usually doctors start at a low dose to determine tolerance factors. So I was very shocked to see that in Bob's case, he was prescribed Concerta at a level of 54 milligrams, which is 3 times the recommended starting dose for that particular medication.
When one is dealing with dangerous drugs that have potentially very serious side effects, one has to be very, very careful about how they're prescribed and if they're prescribed at all.
Concerta has been known to have a wide range of side effects, and some of the more problematic side effects can include agitation, mania, delusions, disturbances of thought and cognition, and in a sense, even some breaches of reality.
After 5 days of taking the medication, on the 6th day, I was sitting in my executive office and I was overwhelmed with the feelings of that somebody was after me. Somebody was going to hurt me, and that I had to get out of that building right away. Got in the elevator, got to the bottom floor, and I ran to the front of the building. Then I kind of paused and turned around. I think I was actually, at that moment, witnessing my own mind. Why did I just do that? That's when I knew something was terribly wrong. I was overwhelmed with paranoia, and I had suffered what I found out later to be an acute psychosis. That was the problem, was trying to understand what happened to me. I told my wife Lisa at the time something weird was going on in my mind, and she was always being the great comforter spouse as far as, no, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine. She was very good at keeping me in the game. After what happened with the acute psychosis, obviously I stopped taking that drug right away. It's very hard to open up to anybody about what was going on. What took place over the next 90 days was just life-changing. Social withdrawal, dysfunctional state of paranoia. I left my car keys in the silverware drawer for 3 weeks. I was leaving kids behind at daycare centers, and it literally felt like I couldn't sleep for 90 days. Could not concentrate whatsoever. I would sit at home and I would read books, and I could not even comprehend and tell you what that chapter was about. It came to the conclusion that work was causing all my stress, and we weren't able to identify that it was actually the overdose that triggered everything. So at that point, I was very much on the edge of harming myself.
I first met Bob Schwartz in 2005, and at that point became his outpatient psychologist. He first arrived in my office in a state of acute turmoil. He was confused, he was stressed, he was highly anxious. He didn't know what was happening to him mentally, and he was looking for help. We did do some initial psychological testing. Based on some additional history-taking psychosocial data that we got about his family, I ruled out some of the other common kinds of explanatory conditions like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety disorders. All of that seemed not to be part of his history. So my only conclusion was that this was something that got generated by a traumatic event. I realized that he was a very high-functioning individual, very successful in the business world, and then all of that changed very markedly upon the administration of this drug, Concerta. The medical term for Bob's condition is medication-induced psychotic disorder, but what it involves is a breakdown of mental functioning and reality contact caused by the ingestion of a foreign substance. He was in an emotional low point, clearly. I mean, he was depressed, he was anxious, he was fearful, he was confused. It wasn't even shown all the time by crying. Sometimes it was shown by the efforts he made not to cry. But you could still see the pain. Since Bob was very concerned about these ongoing and noticeable cognitive inefficiency, for lack of a better term, I had made a recommendation that he seek a neuropsychological exam, and I referred him to Dr. Jason King for that purpose. And later on, Bob sought another independent exam through Wake Forest University in North Carolina back in 2017.
My level of comprehension had been significantly damaged.
At that point, he was diagnosed with a mild neurocognitive disorder by the neuropsychologist at Wake Forest.
My intuitiveness had been damaged. My ability to add numbers had been significantly damaged.
I came to realize the contrast between Bob's pre-morbid functioning, the level of functioning that he was enjoying up to that point in his life, prior to this prescription being made, and the result of it afterwards, the short-term result and then some of the longer-term neurocognitive challenges that came around because of that is very striking, and it really is cataclysmic in scope.
Lisa insisted that I leave my job. She was just kind of like, you know what, I'm more concerned about you. After leaving MCI WorldCom, that was going down another DEPCON. Basically for 2 years, I tried my best to keep the family afloat, trying to figure out how can we get Bob back to the old Bob. There was a lot of frustration on Lisa's part, and that trickled down to the family. What's wrong with Dad? You know, why can't Dad be the dad that he's always been? I didn't realize at the time that there might never ever be an opportunity to get back to being the old Bob. Lisa lost patience and something that nobody could understand. Lisa needed to protect herself and the kids from what was going on. No matter how hard I tried to go back to being the old guy, I just don't think that was ever a possibility.
Hearing about Bob getting divorced, to hear that was shocking, to be honest. I mean, just, you know, how does this happen? Extremely surprising to me, based on the history that I'd had with him for the previous 8 years going into that. I mean, great family man. Again, the type of person that I was trying to model my family behavior around.
After the divorce, the kids never looked at me the same. And I think they were hurt because of all the stories of growing up at Schwartz. Here's their hero walked away from the family. That's the one that stings the most.
Soon after his harrowing psychotic event in 2004, Bob contacted Johnson & Johnson to report the severe side effects he had experienced.
I reached out to Johnson & Johnson immediately and told them that something terrible was wrong.
After acknowledging Bob's possible event triggered by Concerta, Johnson & Johnson requested Bob's medical records and acknowledged that any adverse effects of their products must be reported to the FDA. Bob completed a medical release authorization form, allowing Johnson & Johnson to obtain his medical records from his trusted family physician.
And I sent everything off, had it witnessed by Lisa, sent off them, never heard back from them again.
Bob wrote, "Over the last 90 days, this has been a life-changing situation. I greatly need your help." Bob never heard back from Johnson & Johnson. After years of turmoil in his life, with the help of his brother Thomas, in August 2018, Bob wrote to the Chief Privacy Officer at Johnson & Johnson asking what happened to the evaluation and investigation that was promised back in 2004. 3 weeks later, the Safety Division of Janssen, a division of Johnson & Johnson, replied that they requested Bob's medical records 3 times from the treating physician. No records were ever sent. Instead of notifying Bob, Janssen filed an empty report to the FDA about Bob's event, and then failed to contact him about the status for almost 14 years. I was appalled that Johnson & Johnson was so unresponsive to Bob, and why they didn't, just for their own state of knowledge and for Bob's benefit, order that an independent medical examination be done. If I had gone through something like that myself, I would have expected to be examined and properly diagnosed and properly treated by those who were responsible for me being in that state of mind.
A new study reveals some ADHD medications may cause an increased risk of psychosis.
Unlike street drugs, there's a misperception prescription drugs are somehow safer.
In 2005, about a year after Bob's ordeal, the news media started reporting on the dangerous side effects some patients were experiencing with Concerta, and the FDA response to these concerns.
After all, that's why these drugs are nicknamed steroids for the brain. And young adults who take amphetamines like Adderall are twice as likely to develop the condition.
The disease is youngsters who are steeped in a culture of violence. They've been drugged in many cases. Many of these young boys have been on Ritalin since they were in kindergarten.
The Wall Street Journal and the LA Times covered the FDA's stern warning regarding the harmful side effects of Concerta. Patients complained of high blood pressure, audio and visual hallucinations, psychotic behavior, and suicidal thoughts. These side effects were happening to patients under normal prescribed doses. Bob approached his primary care physician with this information in August of 2005.
And I told him I think something terribly went wrong with the drug. He said, no, it wasn't the drug. My trusted advisor, and I was just like, well, what's going on with me? I hit levels of apathy that I had never experienced before. I mean, I hit levels of helplessness, hopelessness, and worthlessness that I never knew existed in life.
Bob's doctor phoned him the next day to inform Bob that he was no longer a patient of his and to pick up his file. Bob was fired by his doctor merely for asking for an explanation and help. In 2006, the FDA finally responded to the serious concerns about Concerta by simply requiring an inconspicuous warning label, directing patients to read a medical guide provided by the pharmacist. Only if patients take the time to read the small print in the extensive medical guide will they learn some details about the risks. Here are some of the reported symptoms: new or worsening aggressive behavior or hostility, seeing or hearing things that are not real, believing things that are not real, emergent psychotic or manic symptoms, e.g. hallucinations, delusional thinking, or mania in patients without a prior history of psychotic illness, or mania caused by stimulants at usual doses. If such symptoms occur, consideration should be given to a possible causal role of the stimulant, and discontinuation of treatment may be appropriate. Patients beginning treatment for ADHD should be monitored for the appearance of or worsening of aggressive behavior or hostility. The new labels did little to curb the dangers of Concerta. November 2006, the Composite State Board of Medical Examiners for the state of Georgia concluded that Bob's primary care physician did not violate the Georgia Medical Practice Act and closed the matter. They did not explain the basis for their interpretation of events. They provided no supporting evidence for their conclusion. When reading the Concerta guidelines for proper prescription, the documentation clearly states that Concerta should be administered starting at the lowest possible dose, 18 milligrams for patients of all ages. Yet Bob's prescribed starting dose had been triple that, 54 milligrams, the maximum dose. The Georgia Medical Practice Act clearly states, unprofessional conduct shall include any departure from or failure to conform to the minimum standards of acceptable and prevailing medical practice, and shall also include, but not be limited to, the prescribing or use of drugs. Bob appealed the Georgia Medical Board decision 3 times. Each time, their response was that this matter is closed.
I've approached my story with over 30 attorneys. I have gone to the Georgia Medical Board 3 times. I have gone to the FDA 4 times. I've had the special investigators run this up the ladder. I had reached out to 2 prominent senators, Johnny Isaacson and Chuck Grassley.
In 2006, United States Senator Chuck Grassley, chairman of the Finance Committee, expressed concern about the FDA safety protocol for ADHD drugs, saying it was disjointed and slow. Bob reached out to Senator Grassley's office in 2009.
And in fact, Chuck Grassley was behind one of the movements to regulate ADHD medicine. And I talked to him staffers, and I pleaded with him to help me out.
Bob states, after being on the medication for 6 days, I suffered an amphetamine psychosis followed by a seizure the next day. Getting my health and career back on track has been extremely difficult, mainly because of the lack of help, direction, proper diagnosis, and urgency. It has cost me so much, my family, my career, my reputation. After a number of email exchanges, Bob requested a meeting to review his documentation. He got only an email response simply stating, "Received." That was the last time Senator Grassley's office communicated with Bob.
One of the things that was most sad, really, about Bob's story was the way the medical practice really failed him.
I hit levels of helplessness, hopelessness, and worthlessness that I never knew existed in life.
The litany of indifference Bob has experienced for the past 16 years has taken its toll. This former corporate thoroughbred was hobbled off the fast track and relegated to far less green pastures. He has had to reinvent himself emotionally, professionally, financially, and through his relationships with friends and family.
That's why it's so important that we're all here trying to tell a very difficult story, because I can't be the only person that's gone through this. I can't be.
Over 6 million Americans have been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. Some of the most commonly prescribed ADHD medications are Ritalin, Concerta, and Adderall. All three are powerful stimulants in the family of Schedule II controlled narcotics, the federal designation which also includes amphetamines and cocaine. The active ingredient in both Ritalin and Concerta is methylphenidate. These drugs can have serious side effects, especially for patients who are highly sensitive to the medication. That's why it's so important for any patient taking these drugs to start with the minimum dosage. Today, ADHD drugs are a $20 billion industry. Manufacturers of psychotropic drugs have fallen short of giving the public enough information about the potential risks and dangers of Schedule II medications such as Concerta. I believe that there is a silent universe of other cases like Bob's that exist, much in the same way that there have been silent universes of other victims before, such as in the areas of abuse, where people have not come forward or not felt that that they had a voice, or that there was a sympathetic ear or a knowledgeable ear to hear their case. And I think that that may be the same situation that exists here.
Really what helps Bob is his faith. I think he grounds himself in that faith, and he believes that there is a purpose for him, and I think that's why he's not bitter.
Our first substantial interaction was when Bob reached out to me and asked if we could get together for lunch.
At a honey baked ham, went through the whole story with Father Ketter.
This took a lot of courage to share what he did, trusting that, if he and I continued to meet, if it was his desire, that over time I would come to understand in greater depth, exactly what he'd been through.
He told me afterwards, hey, we're just going to keep meeting. And they weren't easy meetings.
What's been the most important thing for Bob is just knowing that God has never been absent in all of this, that he's always been with Bob.
A relationship with God that is so strong, and that basically sustained him through all these terrible crises, and to help others, right, to get to the right destination. Because what really matters in the end, right, is our eternal destiny.
Anybody in that kind of situation needs to be reminded that Romans 8:28, God works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose.
Bob's strong Catholic faith has been his most reliable sustenance.
God could and will bring good from this seemingly tragic situation in his time, in his way, but it was for Bob to just keep the faith and trust and believe, have that hope.
He's the one who really brought my core value of what it was like growing up to be a Schwartz, and that, Jesus never left me. Bob, hang in there. There's something great that's going to happen. God will deliver answers for you.
Bob asked himself, what can I do to warn people about this problem so it doesn't happen to others? Directing his efforts outward to warn and help others is Bob's new focus.
Bob has just grown. He's grown in a way that he didn't anticipate, probably wouldn't have scripted. Nobody would have scripted, but God's got a script for us that is not our own.
Instead of internalizing my story, I have decided to share it with everyone, to make this industry a safer industry.
In 2021, Bob formed a nonprofit organization to raise awareness about the risks of ADHD drugs and caution patients and doctors to be careful regarding ADHD diagnoses and the prescription and safe dosing of related medications.
It would be very appropriate, to have additional safeguards that are sent to doctors. Say, look, watch out. This is the latest research that's come out on this, but also at the level of pharmacies. I think all that information is vital and very, very important, that people should be given that information so they could just make good choices.
Through credentialing, so that when people go to a physician or go to a psychiatrist, they'll know that there's some kind of specialization. I think, again, it would apply mostly to non-psychiatric physicians and medical providers. That would be one way that the public could determine if this particular provider has had that kind of training. We can all be accountable to do our part to prevent anyone from experiencing the ordeal that Bob has been going through.
I know I'm not getting back to being the old Bob, But through God's help and society's help, I could be a better Bob. I hope my kids get to see this someday, and they understand that the courage that I sat down and tried to take to tell a difficult story. No, I wasn't there in the past, but we're going to heal this situation and make things better moving forward.